Professor Michael Ruse is an eminent philosopher of science. He's the author of numerous books and a full-tenured professor at the University of Florida. He's spent a career observing and commenting on the cultural struggle between creationists and evolutionists. An avowed unbeliever, he nonetheless argues for a space for religion and science to engage in respectful, informed dialogue, and for opponents to appreciate each other's intellectual history. Now there's an idea. Professor Ruse believes the Christian faith can be reconciled with evolutionary theory. And as we found out, he has some very harsh criticisms for Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists. It's funny you should mention that, because I want to talk to you about a particular scientist who does some philosophy of science in his book, and I have heard you say there are few things more simple than Richard Dawkins' God delusion.
Yeah, no, as I said, makes me ashamed to be an atheist, I think was the phrase I used.
What do you mean by that? In what way is it simple or simplistic?
Well, I think it's not simple, it's simplistic. I mean, there's nothing wrong with KISS, keep it simple, stupid. I mean, one of the virtues of science is simplicity. The trouble with Dawkins, I mean, maybe this is envy. The guy sold 3 million copies of the book. I wish I'd sold 3 million copies of one of my books. I mean, the trouble is, he just doesn't take the things that he's talking about seriously. Now, I defer to nobody in my admiration for Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, which he published 30 years ago, about the nature of genetics. Now, I don't care whether you agree with the book or not, but it seems to me that that is a serious attempt to understand aspects of the nature of biology. Now, if somebody comes along, and a woman called Mary Midgley did just this, and comes in and says, oh, well, that must be stupid because genes can't be selfish, I think Dawkins has got every right at this point to say, hang on a minute, I know that. I'm using a metaphor. Look at what I'm trying to do with this metaphor and see. Now, you may disagree with what I'm trying to do, but at least try to understand what's going on. I think Dawkins has a perfectly legitimate case there. Now, I want to say equally that I think the theologian or the religious person or the philosopher, and to a certain extent this is a turf war, I think that they have equal right to turn to Dawkins and say, look, if you're going to criticize this stuff, fair enough, but try to make an effort to understand what the position is. Now, I think a classic case would be Dawkins going after the cosmological argument, the causal argument. The causal argument, everything has a cause, the world is a thing, therefore the world must have a cause, call it God. Okay? Philosophy 100, undergraduate response, what caused God? We've all done it. We've all been there. And, it's a good question, but, it's not the end of the argument. Dawkins then triumphantly says, there you are, bad argument, let's move on.
Well, he in fact thinks he has found a new argument that disproves God to a high probability.
Right. Push with the cosmological argument for a moment. You know, and I know, that Christians, St. Augustine, certainly St. Thomas, spent a hell of a lot of... they knew this. And so what they were trying to do was articulate a notion of God who would be first cause. The whole notion of aseity, God as a necessary being. God, God's essence is his existence. Now, if Dawkins wants to say, as David Hume would say, that the whole notion of necessary being doesn't work or something like that, then let's talk about that. Let's argue that. I'm inclined to think it might be right. But at least let's, have the honesty, or the intellectual integrity to look at these things and look at the responses that the Christian philosophers, let's say just the Christian philosophers, have made. You may want to rough them up afterwards, but it's like selfish genes. At least do your homework. Now, the trouble with Dawkins is, I think, that he doesn't get to that point. Now, sure, of course, Dawkins, he's got a sort of a fuselage of things. That the God of the Old Testament is an ethnic cleanser, and, to be perfectly honest, the God of the Old Testament is a bit of an ethnic cleanser. But, of course, and I know, that, let us call it a traditional Christian, what I mean is the Christian of St. Augustine, the Christian of St. Thomas and Luther and Calvin, knows these things right down the line. And of course, what they do is you work with these things. You work with how the whole notion of a God was revealed gradually to the Jews, and obviously does not become, manifest in some full sense, at least until Jesus, if not until St. Paul. I mean, we can argue about the Jesus-Paul issue, but you know exactly what I mean. I mean, the point is, Christians have got some grown-up responses to these sorts of things. And I think that Dawkins does a serious misservice to the cause of non-belief by not being prepared to take seriously the kinds of things that believers believe in. I mean, of course, who honestly thinks, for instance, that it's going to be okay for you, John, to say, oh, well, I'm going to take one of my kids and take them up to, the highest point in Sydney and sacrifice them. I mean, is every Christian in Sydney going to say, oh, John, what a wonderful man you are? Or are they going to say, let's get this guy to a psychiatrist as quickly as we can? So this is the point I want to make, not whether or not Christianity works. I mean, frankly, I'm not sure that it does for me. But whether or not the Christian can at least articulate a reasoned defense, which we can then argue about. And that's basically the beef I have with people like Dawkins.